Okay, I am going to hit start. So here we go. Great. Good luck.
All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to share some of our thinking around scaling B2B SaaS companies with a special focus on community building. As you know, Stack Overflow is all about communities with a focus on developers and technologists. And we're in the midst of transforming ourselves and scaling into a very, very fast growing SaaS company. So I myself, my name is Prashanth Chandrasekar. I joined as the CEO of Stack Overflow back in October of 2019. So I've been about 10 months in seat. And I joined after about a 7-year stint as a senior leader at Rackspace, where I led their cloud services business. And as you know, Rackspace recently, or likely know, Rackspace recently went public after about 4 years being in the private market. So a great story for them. So to kick things off, what I thought I would do is I would want to kind of reference this this great chart that I've used, both at Stack Overflow with my teams, also at Rackspace. And it's a chart by Scott Belsky, who is the CPO of Adobe, also my classmate and friend from business school from over 14, 15 years ago. And he wrote this book called The Messy Middle. And what it really shows is there are a tremendous number of ups and downs as we kind of go through this scale journey, right? And many of you that have sort of been in the midst of this, or in the messy middle, so to speak, have experienced this. And so I think as long as, from my perspective, as long as the slope of this line is on a positive upward trajectory, you're in good shape. So it's critical that as CEOs and as leaders of SaaS companies, that it's important to take a step back and detach from what you're actually sort of in the thick of, and really assess the general slope of your scaling story. Because it's very easy to get bogged down with either a downward trend, which is somewhat temporary, or even an upward trend that's somewhat temporary. So I thought I would boil this down to 4 key pillars in terms of how I think about scaling organizations up to that 250 million mark. And again, keeping community at the center. And I'll focus a lot on that topic given our vantage point at Stack Overflow. So the 4 pillars, there are some key questions that you have to ask as you go on the scale journey, right? So the first one is somewhat, obviously important, but also quite covered, and people have talked about this quite a bit. You can talk about Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. You've got Eric Ries. You've got a whole bunch of folks that have talked about this, especially early on. So, I don't have to talk about it from a founder perspective. But fundamentally, what you're trying to do here is you're trying to understand what are the ways in which you can ensure that your product is really sound, solving a big problem for customers before you scale, right? And how do you expand ultimately, once you figure that out, how do you expand the scope of your use cases over time to ultimately make your product even more pervasive, across the board? Secondly, you've got go-to-market approach and expansion. So, obviously there are many ways to go to market, and, ultimately we just need to understand what are the options, what are the most appropriate ones, and how do you decide for your own organization? And how do you ultimately then expand your go-to-market, given there are so many different options? And how do you, again, pick amongst the different choices that you have? The third pillar, competitive differentiation. So this is really where, I will focus, my comments on the community quite a bit. And I believe that's an underestimated area of competitive differentiation. But with so many companies and startups and, all the incumbents of the world being disrupted, by literally hundreds and thousands of companies that are being funded to effectively disaggregate or, decouple certain parts of the value chain so they can actually add value in an even more efficient way. How do you stand out from the pack and grow despite all this competition? And then finally, a topic that's not necessarily talked about as much, which I think is very relevant, is a stage-specific team. So I think it's quite difficult in my experience that you go from 0 to 250 million of revenue with the same team, whether that's across product or other go-to-market functions and so on. There's a lot that, there needs to be sort of, it's almost an evolution of not only sort of the company as an organism, but, the people, that are really running the play, and you just effectively need different types of skills along the way. So I will focus a lot of my time on number 3 and number 4, because, lots been written about number 1 and number 2. So I just, thought it would be a better focus of our time. So number 1, product market fit for completeness and expansion, just to kick things off. The key points here, you really want to focus on the fit side, which is the first of 2 sides of this equation. really delivering repeatable value very early on the customer journey, right? So this is many of us that have sort of been involved with launching new products or businesses. There is always going to be this temptation, especially when you're getting going, big customers coming down and saying, listen, like, I will pay you a lot of money to effectively do this and this and this. And this is typically that could be a complete drain on your resources internally, especially when you're trying to be a product-led company and you're building for a lot of scale. And you want to make sure that we talk a lot about the last mile of customization and really building configurable products, as we like to say, within Stack Overflow versus just highly customized products. And so I learned this lesson very the hard way. When early on in my career, when we were launching capability around creating a sort of a service around DevOps as a concept, and the temptation again to take on larger customers that want to define a lot of your individual requirements really takes away from your ability to drive something at scale. The second point here is around really measuring leading indicators, this versus just waiting for the end of the year type renewal, which is typically way too late, in terms of figuring out if you've really got product market fit. So you want to make sure that you're, figuring out product adoption, in-product nudges, and there's so many tools these days that allow you to do that effectively. We use them at Stack Overflow, like Intercom and Pendo and all these other tools, and really customer success driving this adoption and really understanding in a very detailed fashion what is likely to happen towards the end of the renewal period. And then on the expansion side, you've got a couple of things to consider. One is the problem journey, right? When you think about the problem you're solving for customers, it's likely that there are plenty of adjacent problems to the left of the problem you're solving and to the right of the problem that you're solving. A good example of this is at Rackspace, where where I was leading the cloud services business. When companies came to us, they came to us because they loved our managed services capability. We were a services company, and that's very much sort of later down the phase of where customers, were thinking about the cloud. You also have phases before that, which are the architecture phase, and you have effectively a design phase, thinking about which possible cloud to choose between AWS and Azure and Google. So all those different problem statements, and even problem statements after, like cost optimization, all those things are, very important in the context of making sure that there are important considerations before and after. So you have to figure out ultimately where you want to focus, and ultimately figure out, in terms of your problem statement, can you move earlier on in that cycle, or can you move after that cycle once you solve the immediate problem at hand? Secondly, we've got, in terms of the second part of the expansion problem, is use cases. So when you think about use cases for adjacent organizations, there's a lot to be said around figuring out what your immediate target group is all about. So when you think about, if you're serving, let's say, an engineering organization, like we do in Stack Overflow for Teams, which is typically the place where we typically serve customers, then it expands to things like DevOps, perhaps to site reliability engineering, to architecture teams, to product teams, perhaps to product marketing teams, customer success teams, and so on. Ultimately, you have to probably, very likely, in fact, make changes to your product over as you sort of expand those use cases, but those are opportunities for expansion. Second pillar, with go-to-market approach and expansion. So a big part here, when you think about the key points, again, with the two sides of the coin around the approach and the expansion. If I think about approach, the first part here is you have to ultimately decide as an organization whether you're product-led, whether you're sales-led, or you're marketing-led organization. And this is important because ultimately you want to try and ensure that you've got alignment across your company. And this is, it's easier said than done, because there's a lot of considerations around where you are as an organization at the current moment, where you are in the context of where you're going. And there's a tremendous amount of maturity elements that need to be in place for you to be able to move in whatever direction you choose. And there are trade-offs with all things. And ultimately, you have to decide, do you really care about serving the ultimate end user, or do you care about focusing on the CIO and CTO type sale, or are you somewhere in between? But this is a very deliberate choice, making this determination, which aligns a lot of folks around your company. Secondly, when you think about freemium and free trials, this aspect is important because it's hard to be in enterprise B2B SaaS these days without the ability for users or customers to try before they buy. And so, especially these days, developers and technologists do a lot of the decision making. They influence the ultimate decision in a tremendous way, and they ultimately hold the power and the influence and increasingly are making, the recommendations on all sorts of critical decisions like cloud providers or internal, asynchronous and synchronous collaboration software and so on. And this is especially true when you're thinking about a bottoms-up product-led motion, which is obviously becoming more and more common in the SaaS world. And then you've got a choice around, direct and indirect sales. And, you ultimately, you can't do it all, in my experience. So you have to figure out, you have to pick one primary motion, and, whether that's direct or indirect, and progress to the next one in a very systematic fashion. Ultimately, indirect will get you the ability to scale very rapidly, but you can't do that unless you actually have a very solid foundation with your direct go-to-market motion. And then probably one of the most important things that, again, is somewhat overlooked, especially when, folks are flush with cash and, and with the ability to fund businesses, is you have to make the unit economics work. And I believe that this needs to be an explicit priority for your company as it scales, if you want to sort any sort of long-term fundamental value creation and sort of return on invested capital. So this is super critical for it to kind of ultimately last for your company to be sustainable for the long run. On the flip side, expansion, there are probably three dimensions that you can think of. One is verticals, and this is fairly obvious, industry verticals. This could be financial services, could be healthcare, and so on. At Stack Overflow, as an example, financial services is a big vertical for us in our team's SaaS product. And we have, there's an opportunity to effectively leverage a vertical go-to-market strategy to think about solutions, packages, bundles, how you think about attach rates if you've got related products that are able to be sold together. So that's a very, very key area of focus that allow you to really sell, bigger ACV type deals to your clients. Secondly, our segments, and this is again also fairly self-explanatory when you think about small business, medium-sized businesses, enterprises, and vice versa. If you go the other way around, enterprise, mid-market, SB, and you have to figure out what direction you want to move. At Rackspace, originally we actually started out as an SMB-focused company, but we moved into the enterprise over the many years. At Stack Overflow, especially our team's SaaS product, we actually started in the enterprise, and then we have now actually expanded that into the mid-market and also into the SB or small business world. Geographic areas. This is kind of a tremendous opportunity, especially the world that we live in, and it's very dynamic, and you have a tremendous amount of entrepreneurship and growth worldwide. So if your business is based in the US, how much of that foundation is applicable in the context of the international regions, whether that's EMEA or APAC, and ultimately if the value proposition is the same, you've got a good solid foundation. But of course, there's going to be a level of effort with regards to local language support. There's currency, there's billing, there's local go-to-market teams. So there are definitely, it's not as easy as it sounds, but it is effectively, though, a very deliberate expansion strategy. So those are the first two pillars. So let's now move to competitive differentiation. And so out of this, I thought I'd cover both the common things that people think about here, plus also community. So let me start out with product. Product is probably easily the most thought out, or kind of the most leveraged way to differentiate your company when most B2B SaaS companies start these days. So this includes a range of different things, right? Features and quality and reliability and price and distribution and so on. And all of that together, ultimately allows you to really distinguish yourself. And, there are so many companies and examples around, folks that have done this. Even if you look outside the tech sector, think about reliability. When you think about, Honda and Toyota, cars that you probably bought when you were in college because they were going to run for 200,000 miles. And there was, that they made an entire, they differentiated themselves amongst the pack using that strategy. Secondly, one that's also obviously quite prevalent is brand. And so when you think about brand, there are many ways to think about this: values, heritage, packaging, convenience, customer support, quality, you name it, right? So there's all these kind of traditional ways. Any marketer is, looking forward to this. And also great examples here of companies that have built tremendous businesses. One example that comes to mind, let's take customer support, is Zappos, the shoe retailer that's part of Amazon. Built a tremendous business out of customer support at the heart of their brand building efforts. And so so the second pillar is about brand. Now, the third pillar is all around community. And I believe that this is one of the most underestimated ways in which people can actually differentiate their company and their strategy and how they actually think about building a long-term sustainable business. And I believe there are also 5 key tenets to building a great community. And we know this example, we know this because obviously at Stack Overflow, we breathe this every day. So the first part is all around shared identity. So in our case, it's all about developers and technologists who love helping their fellow developers and technologists. And so there's this kind of real camaraderie and real sense of sharing and really creating something that's going to change the world. And developers just have that in their DNA. They love to help each other. And that's why we get up in the morning, we're so excited about that mission. Secondly, you've got incentives and rewards for users. And this is all around the gamification that gives the participants in the community a tremendous sense of accomplishment. In our case, they're helping obviously their fellow developers and technologists. They're showcasing their skill in the community on Python and Ruby and AWS and all sorts of other topics. And this incentive and reward system that's been built with the upvotes and the downvotes by our amazing founders many years ago has lasted over a decade. And this is a key tenet to being able to maintain the community. The third aspect is building with the community. And this is all about not building for the community, but building it in partnership with the community. So when we think about power users and we think about what we call the meta user base at Stack, you have to build, you can't just build it from outside in, you have to build it from within. So, our product and engineering community teams led by our Chief Product and Technology Officer, Teresa Dietrich, are doing a really great job of partnering with the community and building it with them versus, independently outside of them. Next, we've got breaking down silos, which is all around making sure that associated communities are, you break down silos so they can actually work together. So we're in this sort of process at the moment where we think about, we have a lot of full stack engineering topics. There's cloud, there's DevOps, there's AI, ML, data science. There's a whole host of other technology-centric topics. How do you make sure that these communities are somewhat linked in a way that allows people to have a broader perspective and are being helped in a multiple dimensional way? And all of this creates these virtuous cycles between not only the, in our case, the public community and all our paid SaaS products, but it really creates this, ecosystem of communities and products, as we like to say, that generates this momentum. And that's why we have, the vast scale that we do at Stack Overflow. Another kind of final point I'd like to mention here is the order in which you actually do this is important. Most companies start with product, they move to create a great brand, and then ultimately they maybe think about communities. In my opinion, again, people don't often think about communities as much. But there are examples like Stack Overflow or even many open source communities these days, or companies like, let's say, MongoDB, that went from building a phenomenal community to creating a great brand in that ecosystem, and then ultimately created a product. Stack Overflow, we're on this journey because we're now creating SaaS products after we started, with a great community, we built a great brand, and now we've been, really transforming into a SaaS company. And so this order, I would ask yourself as a SaaS company, are you first of all focused on all three? Where are you in this kind of evolution? And ultimately, which direction are you going in? And communities, is becoming more and more relevant, and people are beginning to recognize it. So we look at some external research. First Round Capital recently put this out, which is that 80% of founders reported that it was important to their business, and about 30% or 28% said it was critical to their business. I suspect that in a world that's becoming increasingly remote, community will become even more prevalent as a source of competitive differentiation, because you can only do so much with product and brand in such a highly virtual environment. All right, and if you even look outside the tech space, there are examples of this. You think about Peloton, I'm sure many of you are customers, especially given what we're going through at the moment. They have built, a massive home fitness community, and they've broken up this isolated exercising activity into a group and really a community activity, which is phenomenal. Similarly, Upwork, massive community of freelancers and permalancers, and they've used their site and app to ensure that everybody feels supported. As a result, they also built a really material community. And of course, Stack Overflow over the past 10 years, we have got over 120 million monthly users. And just last year, we have about 2.7 million questions that were asked on our platform. And overall, we have now over 50 million questions and answers. And so this gives you a sense of the scale and the virtuous cycles that you can actually create if you focus on the community. So in summary, obviously, we love and we obsess about the community. We're blessed to work with developers and technologists to create these communities on our public platform, and also internal communities through our Stack Overflow for Teams SaaS product. And ultimately, the developer DNA of sharing and aligning, to our mission statement of helping write the script of the future by serving developers and technologists really, allows us to feel really excited in the morning to come to work and really be able to go after this. And so in summary, I'll say that when you think about communities, this third pillar of competitive differentiation, what comes to mind is actually something that Warren Buffett has been talking about for years. And, he celebrated his 90th birthday recently as a very happy man. And he talks about moats, and he talks about strategy moats. And, imagine this medieval castle and the body of water around it. And, community is a strategy moat. It very much is. And, ultimately, it's a moat because it promotes stickiness. The many-to-many interactions between the community create virtuous cycles with organic scale. And then ultimately, what you're trying to accomplish as a company is competitive differentiation, an advantage which cannot be replicated. It's core to the strategy, and that's ultimately the goal, right? And so in our case, like I said, we have this community of 120 million users, which serves as a tremendous moat for us and an ecosystem, and that moat surrounds our paid SaaS products, Stack Overflow for Teams, which is a private version of our public platform, and also serves very much the same users with all the other products that we have. And then finally, the fourth pillar that I'll cover off here in a little bit of a faster fashion is a stage-specific team. So I truly believe this is not talked about enough, and I do think that it makes a huge difference, especially when you're scaling from 0 to 250. So, Jason Lemkin of SaaStrix has talked about, kind of the various phases and the go-to-market approaches and so on. So I'm just going to use some broader definitions here, both in terms of, what's early, and I've split it up into early, mid, and late. And let's assume for, illustrative purposes, is sort of in this first phase of call it 0 to 20 or 25 million of revenue. And what you typically experience is on the product side, you start out with a fairly small, tight-knit group, founder-led, a lot of blurry lines, no fancy titles. And a lot of them are really, cross-product engineering and architecture and functions like that typically. And you have a lot of focus on direct customer feedback. And you need to get to the heart of the customer problem, because that's where you are, trying to figure it out in terms of the product market fit that we talked about earlier on. And ultimately solving this customer problem, which is hopefully a huge problem, with your product and with a lot of deep customer empathy. On the go-to-market side, what you're likely to start out with is more often than not an evangelist type sales leader. And this is typically somebody who's quite close to the product and the customer problem. He may even be not, or he or she may not be a typical sales leader. It may be somebody that's actually a lot more product centric. And that's good. In this phase of the journey, it's very important to be very, very tied to that. And I would argue throughout your journey, but even more so important in this part of the journey. And then your team that you have, which is likely a combined sales and customer success team, is a ragtag group of both folks that have not always had, not all of them come from typical sales backgrounds. Many of them are very focused on, this kind of early phase and are excellent at it. And that's what you need at this phase. When you move on to sort of this mid phase, which is sort of in between, call it again, 2025 to let's say 70 or 75 million, again, using broad definitions. When you think about the product side, you're going to need a much more sort of full, product team with specialization. And this is where you have product management and user research and product design and, all the other functions that all of you are familiar with. And then on the go-to-market side, you're going to move to a lot more of a builder or VP of sales, somebody who has a lot of discipline, cadence, methodology, things like, BANT, which we used to use at Rackspace in the sales organization. We use MEDPIC at Stack Overflow in our sales organization. And then there's a lot of specialization of the sales org at this stage. And, Jason Lemkin talks a lot about this in terms of specialized sales. And then finally, when you think about, inbound marketing and inbound and outbound sales development, a lot of scaled efforts around demand generation engines with tools like Marketo and those sort of things. And then finally, you have a separate customer success organization that obsesses about renewals and upgrades and so on. And so this is this mid phase. And then when you progress even further, you have to take it up even one more notch, right? In terms of the late stage of this game, where when you think from a product standpoint, you've got all those mid-stage items that we just talked about, even more of an obsessive focus on voice of customer advisory boards, roadmap reviews, offering management, which includes like exploration and business cases and commitment pitches, a lot more diligence around, when you actually do certain things, a lot more deliberate focus on market differentiation versus market relevance, especially when you're likely to have a lot more competition at this phase. So you have to, because incumbents are going to notice your presence because you've actually scaled to this stage in the game. And resource allocation here becomes completely paramount. Teresa, our Chief Product Officer, and I talked a lot about this at Stack, and she also had a session around focus at an earlier session earlier in SaaStr. And so this is the kind of, this topic here is all about making sure that we pick our spots in terms of where we actually allocate resources. And then finally, go to market. When we think about the various capabilities, you not only think about the build a VP, but you moved on now to like this forecast machine and predictability, and a VP of sales who can actually do that, right? And so that is important. Then everything that I mentioned in the prior stage, but also on top of that, a lot of enablement, a lot of operational rigor around sales strategy, territory planning, deal desk, you name it. And so much has been written about this topic, so I won't sort of belabor the point. And then ultimately, that allows you to effectively scale your go-to-market. So in terms of key takeaways, just to make sure it lands in terms of the 4 main pillars. Number 1, product market fit and expansion. Number 2, go-to-market approach and expansion. Number 3, competitive differentiation. Again, 3 ways to do it: product, brand, and community. Again, underestimated area of competitive differentiation, and the order matters. And then ultimately, a stage-specific team. So if you focus on these 4, I hope that's useful to you. And we definitely use this frame at Stack Overflow on our teams, and I've used it in my career throughout my time at Rackspace and while I moved over here. And I think it relates. I think one of the primary things I hope you're leaving with is that community is a sort of really great core axis of competitive differentiation. And as we progress in our SaaS scale journey, we believe that is for us. And we hope it is going to be for your companies. If you'd like to learn more about how we help companies build communities, whether they're externally on a public platform or internally with our Stack Overflow for Teams SaaS product, please reach out to us on this email that's been set up primarily just for this event. So it's SaaStr, just as this event spelled, SaaStr@stackoverflow.com. And I hope this was useful to everybody. So I will stop there, and I will take any questions that folks might have. All right. Let me see. There's some questions coming in. All right. Is there a specific, is there a specific platform you recommend for managing rewards and incentives? Great question, Andrea. I think obviously at Stack, we use what we've built over the years, and the algorithm and the kind of the logic there is all based on there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot of experimentation over the years, and this is the whole point I was mentioning around the meta community. So there are no I don't believe there are any sort of off-the-shelf capabilities. That's why we're sort of in the world that we are in. We help create communities. And so there's an opportunity to leverage Stack Overflow pretty much, for all your, the rewards and incentive systems that are in place. Most of the other companies, if you think about, other companies that have created sort of their own, have mostly been internal mechanisms to showcase, whether that's like employee, in some cases, people are gamifying how they think about, expense management. And some companies are showcasing, how employees have actually saved money for the company and showcasing that. So they've mostly built them on their own. But of course, if you think about technology communities, we believe you can leverage Stack Overflow for that, either in the public space or the private space. Next, let's see, in terms of, this is an interesting question. App development seems to have exploded since COVID. Any data or learnings on why? Well, I think in general, if you look at the macro trends that are underway, you've got, you've heard digital transformation, it's a big buzzword, but I would say in general, it's the movement to the cloud is a fundamental move. Like it's been happening for, over a decade actually, but it's actually still very early in the transformation of that for all the companies around the world. So, estimates are that it's probably close to about $1 trillion of IT spend or even more that will ultimately move to the cloud. And so that is a fundamental driver of saying, ultimately, when you do architect for the cloud, you have to do it in a very, very specific way. As we talk about internally, it's around, we have how do you make sure that there's not a sort of a singular monolith, and there's, true flexibility when you're able to build cloud applications and so on. So a lot of that is fueling it. The move around DevOps is a huge aspect, and making sure that there's real connectivity, not only internally between your dev and ops teams and so on, but also with customers, which is ultimately the purpose, which is to make sure you're very close to your customers to build things that, ultimately what they care about. And so all those underlying kind of forces, those two, plus of course, remote work, as you point out, and companies realizing that, this is not a kind of a temporary phenomenon. It's going to be around for a long time. The impact of COVID-19, that is all causing people to think very diligently about their digital transformation strategy. And I believe that's why those three forces, cloud, DevOps, and then of course, remote work more broadly is causing this kind of massive move to digitization. All right, let me think about a couple more questions here. There's one about Stack Overflow's community efforts. Where have they actually failed over time? So this is an interesting question, and I think it's a good one. I think over the years, there is, I mentioned this power user base, the meta community, and when we started as an organization and the community back in 2008, that was the core focus. It's all about working with that very specific power user community. And over the years, I think there was sort of varying levels of focus on that topic and being able to be very deliberate about it. And being able to, follow through on thinking about, what does the community actually care about, and how do we make sure we deliver on those promises, given the resources that the company has, and also, of course, having this kind of goal of being a sustainable company over time. So that I think was tough. I think over the years for the company, what we've done more recently is said, let's actually think about this as a product. Our primary product is the public platform. So what we did is effectively treated that as a product. By itself. So all the product principles and, again, our product organization has done a tremendous job, and our community team, et cetera, of this is making sure that we think, build a roadmap, be very deliberate about what the community actually wants, and being able to deliver and showcase and really be able to, follow through on our commitments and really take the input of the folks, again, in that power user base, and also expand it to new users. To make sure that it's inclusive and welcoming of all the folks around the world that want to enter software development, which is an increasingly large number. And so that whole balancing act, I think, historically has been a tough one to navigate, but I think we've got a great path going forward. I think we've made some really good strides with our team over the past 9 months. Another one, can you give an example of how you would build a community in a traditionally conservative environment like a financial technology or services company? Great question. I mean, this is, we believe that there are almost 60% plus of information that is shared and, collaborated, or people use to collaborate is actually private information, which is the reason why we actually launched our Stack Overflow for Teams product. And this is actually, it's not surprising to us that financial services is actually the #1 vertical for our Stack Overflow for Teams product, because a lot of that information is proprietary. Beyond, of course, the information that's public, which is all around, fundamental concepts around all the technology that you want to learn about, whether it's Python or Ruby or AWS and so on. But the point is that in financial services institutions, there's plenty that is proprietary that they now use capabilities like ours with our Teams product to be able to share internally. So that's why we build internal communities with Teams, and we, of course, build external communities with our public platform. This is an excellent question by Sagar. What do you think the cost runway of startups is for starting from the community rather than starting from the product? Usually communities take long to actually become something profitable. Great question. And I think this is one where you have to decide ultimately, what is the long game? What is like what is the company's objective, in terms of what you're trying to solve and what the problem is. And if you think about companies like MongoDB, they were very deliberate about this. It was one of those things that ultimately started, again, with a very, very, very specific shared identity around, the space that they operate in, which of course is not focused on traditional relational databases. And that focus and, with keeping profit and keeping the business side second, in many ways allowed them to effectively create a problem statement very rapidly because of the commonality of the community and the virtuous cycles that I was explaining before. That solved a problem in a very rapid way. Another example here would be OpenStack, which is more of a private cloud capability. And that also in many ways started because of the shared identity of wanting to be open source in many ways. That's sort of taken a different trajectory. But the point is that, the ability to get some critical mass and for you to create a product or capability or shared technology is very rapid in that sort of sense. And that allows you to, effectively build this great fundamental ecosystem, like I was mentioning with Stack Overflow, and then you can progress to the other parts like MongoDB did or Stack Overflow is doing at the moment. There's one question about, why don't you piggyback or leverage GitHub's presence in communities more? So GitHub actually solves a very specific problem around code repository, and of course, phenomenal product. We're partners with GitHub. Our Stack Overflow for Teams capability integrates with GitHub Enterprise. We actually serve many of the same customers in a very joint fashion, but we also integrate in the public community. So meaning you can actually sign up with it. You can log into Stack Overflow with your GitHub account, right, in the public community side. So we've actually done some really great things. I connect with Nat Friedman, the CEO of GitHub, quite often, and we are very aligned on where the world is going in terms of the impact of developers and technologists and the tremendous opportunity we have to really make an impact for the world to write the next generation set of applications. So we have integrated, but they solve a different problem and we solve a different problem. I think they focus on code repository and really making sure that that information is freely shared, and how do they make sure that that is highly effective. And we focus on, of course, being kind of like the knowledge base with regards to all sorts of problems. And we've recently expanded to new form factors called longer form content called articles beyond the Q&A format, especially in our Teams product. And we'll be also thinking about that in the context of the public community. Okay, and let's see, I think there's couple more questions I can take here. Yeah, so this one's interesting. How do you remain authentic to a community and still build a large business on that community? What are the lines not to cross and keep it real and not break the community relationship? So phenomenal question. This is one that we have actually thought about very deeply for a long time. And our thought is that ultimately, like, what are you trying to do? You're trying to serve a very specific user. In our case, it's about serving developers and technologists. That's it. Those are the users that we want to serve. How do you do it? We first started out with a public community that was built with the community that's been serving, of course, that user base for over a decade. And then the question becomes, how do you continue to serve them? What else do they need? So in the context of allowing them to find phenomenal jobs when they're looking for transitions in their careers, how do you make sure they're aware of and being connected with companies that are launching new features? So for example, if AWS launches 1,400 features, how do they actually engage with the community of AWS users and maybe even AWS directly, through our platform? How do we enable them, those same users, developers, and technologists, to be able to share private information if they're working for a financial services company, as an example, right? Like I said, 60% is private. So the way in which we can solve this is to be focused on ultimately who we're serving. And it's all about developers and technologists. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, people have to decide if it is a paid product or unpaid. There's value, of course, that you create that ultimately, hopefully deserves to be paid. And so we focus on creating value. And in some cases, we believe some value should be just out there in the context of the public community, which is obviously created jointly with the community. And then there are capabilities even beyond kind of layer above that in many ways to enable those same users to benefit. And that, of course, we have decided to charge for those. Of course, we want to make sure that, like I said earlier on, there's unit economics, that we are a sustainable kind of company over time. It's important to do that ultimately to, again, serve the community, the same users. So you have to have that understanding and being very clear ultimately with your community. That's what you're doing. And, I think we've done, an increasingly better job over the past, few quarters to make sure it's clear what we're actually trying to accomplish. All right, let's see. Yeah, so there's an interesting one around. How do you build a community around a new product category when the pain is not obvious to most people? And that's an interesting one. I mean, so Azin has asked that question, and ultimately, like I said, you want to solve a problem that's big, right? I think there are many ways. There has got to be some sort of critical mass, people that actually, there are enough people that actually care about a topic. And we've actually put some thought into this in the context of our Stack Overflow, Stack Exchange websites. And if you go to our websites, you'll see that there's an area called literally Area 51, and that's the area. And you can actually go and propose, new sites and new areas that you can create a community around. And organically, through a very specific process that I won't get into here, is how it gets effectively bubbled up in a way that says there's enthusiasm for this topic. So we've thought about this very problem that you're talking about, is how do we know? Well, should we just go pre-populate a bunch of communities that we believe are important in the world, but may or may not be shared? That perspective may or may not be shared by people around the world. That's the reason why you want to make sure that you're building with the community, so that they are also working with you. And if there's interest and you're introducing the topic and there's actually common problems that people are trying to solve, that shared identity comes into the mix and you're able to create a common understanding, and you're able to move from there. Okay, I think yeah, this is an interesting question from Vikram. How do you decide on whether you're a sales-led organization or product-led organization or marketing-led organization? And this is a phenomenal question. Like I said, we talk a lot about this at Stack Overflow, and most SaaS companies, there's a lot of data around this, recently about this, which is, product-led SaaS companies are typically outperforming traditional SaaS companies. And so there's an interesting dichotomy in that, there are many different, it's not easy, by the way, just to say you're product-led and you're just off to the races. I think it's one of those things which people underestimate, again, the amount of work that actually goes into making sure that's highly successful. You got to be hyper-focused on the user. You've got to think about the online experience, the self-serve experience, the ability to really drive adoption, all those elements, that people are aware of. And then sales-led organizations, which is common in in companies like many other enterprise companies in the past have been sales-led, including services companies are also typically sales-led. It's all about, that is more, it sort of depends on kind of the segment that you're focused on. If you're focused a lot on serving a fewer number of customers that have more bespoke requirements, then it's probably okay to be sales-led. But if you're trying to build something at scale, it is more likely than not, you're likely going to choose, a product-led, because that's where you get the virality and you get a lot of common fundamental usage of your product versus, serving a smaller number of customers where you might have to justify a lot of customization. But again, they might write large checks and so on, but you have to decide what type of company you are. Are you a company that's trying to serve 100 customers, or are you a company that's trying to serve millions of customers? So that's, nothing's wrong or right. It's just one of those things where you have to decide, what your company strategy is about. This is an interesting question by Andrea. If most companies start to engage their customers in a community, will there be community fatigue, in quotes? At some point, how many communities will individuals want to be part of? Great question. I really believe that when you think about macro communities, right, that you've often heard about, theorists saying that ultimately in any category, there's probably, a couple leaders. There's typically the top two are the kind of the most prevalent category leaders where people spend all their time. It's kind of like saying, you think back to kind of like the social media days back in the early 2000s. There's all that kind of back and forth with, the Facebooks and the Friendsters and all that. You can't be part of all these social networks, and ultimately, you're just going to be wasting a lot of time. So the question, like, where do you get your biggest bang for your buck? Where's the biggest critical mass? Where's the biggest level of virtuous cycles? And where do you get your job done? In many cases, in our case, we believe in the technologists and developer space, it's Stack Overflow, because again, we have 120 million users, and it's I think it would not make a lot of sense for people to actually then go and focus on that, plus also a whole bunch of other technology communities. So we believe it actually is the one place for people to go to get all their answers. Okay, I think we're at almost at time. So let me just see if there are any other kind of outstanding questions. Yeah, this is an interesting one by Clinton. Can you share any experiences or lessons learned from when you moved to the mid to late stages of scaling and had outgrown your initial services, billing, management, sales, support, assuming they cannot scale without you? Yes. So both stories come to mind from Rackspace. Stories come to mind from Stack Overflow, and I'll use one from Stack Overflow where when we think about Jason Lemkin talks a lot about this in terms of the funnel and obviously things like MQLs and SQLs and so on. And there was a marketing leader, Khaled, and his team were very deliberate about making sure that we were setting up the scale as we sort of went on the SaaS journey. And there was a lot of focus on what are the systems that will help us to get from zero to wherever we ended up in 2018, 2019, and then ultimately now we are kind of progressing to this kind of journey ahead, becoming sort of a kind of very large SaaS company. And the question is your process, your technology, the people. I covered the people earlier. Technology is a huge element of that, but it all starts with it starts with people, then there's probably process, and then technology, as it's commonly known. And so we had his team and him focus a lot on making sure that we replace the systems to make sure that we had a kind of a much more scaled demand generation effort, a lot more visibility and attribution from a marketing standpoint of every single lead that's generated, what truly ultimately resulted in that lead. Was it because of this particular campaign that was kicked off? And being able to track it all the way through. So every dollar that you drop at the top of the funnel, you're able to track all the way to the bottom. And so that level of specificity, which requires a tremendous amount of work and discipline, and the right people and technology changes. We changed out one demand gen system for another, and then ultimately, of course, process to make sure that everybody is trained and using it in a way that ultimately makes sense for us, and then the data is accurate. This is one example that I can portray here. All right. Okay, I think those are all the questions for the most part, in terms of the questions that have been asked, and kind of in terms of being able to kind of hopefully that's been helpful for folks across the board. So thank you again for all your time and your questions. They're amazing questions. And again, if you would like to learn more about how we can help you build your communities, whether that's in our public platform or within your company, please email saster@stackoverflow.com, or you can also look me up on LinkedIn or Twitter at P. Chandrasekar. It's my first initial, my first name and my entire last name. But thank you again for your attention and for your time.